May 1942. In London, under the gray sky scarred by the smoke of war, a decision is made. An assassination operation, the boldest and most desperate of the entire war, receives the green light. The target? It's not Hitler. It's not Goering, nor Goebbels. It's not who you imagine. It's a man whom few outside Germany know by name, but whose actions have already shaped the fate of millions. A man who, within the Third Reich, even the Nazis themselves fear. The man who would die in an ambush in Prague was not just another SS officer. He was Reinhard Heydrich, the brain behind the extermination machine, the architect of terror, and the mission to kill him, a single act of defiance, would cost the lives of more than 5,000 innocents. This was the only time throughout the war that the Allies managed to plan and execute the elimination of a Nazi officer of such high rank, an unprecedented tactical success. But the question that no one wants to answer, the issue that hangs over this story like a shadow, is this: was it worth it? Because what happened after the ambush in Prague was so brutal, so disproportionate, that it still divides historians and philosophers to this day. This is the story of how two ordinary men were sent to kill the impossible, and how their act of courage unleashed one of the bloodiest and most systematic vendettas in history. To understand the magnitude of this act, we must first look at the man. Who was Reinhard Heydrich? Seen from afar, he was the personification of Himmler's Aryan ideal. Tall, blonde, with fine features, a talented athlete, fencing champion, and a gifted musician who found solace playing his violin on quiet nights. But behind the facade of sophistication lay a mind of surgical coldness and a total absence of empathy. He was a man who did not feel, he calculated. Hitler called him the man with the iron heart. Others, more accurately, called him the brain of terror. Heydrich was the main organizer of the RSHA, the Reich Main Security Office, a superagency that unified under his command the Gestapo, the secret police, the Kripo, the criminal investigation police, and the SD, the SS intelligence service. He was the master of shadows, the man who knew all the secrets. His efficiency was legendary and terrifying. In January 1942, he presided over the infamous Wannsee Conference in an elegant mansion on the outskirts of Berlin. For 90 minutes, 15 high-ranking Reich bureaucrats did not discuss whether they should exterminate the Jews of Europe. That decision had already been made. They discussed logistics, freight cars, miles of track, load capacity, travel time, execution methods. Genocide ceased to be an explosion of hatred and became a mathematical operation, an Excel spreadsheet from hell. At the end of the meeting, while the others felt uncomfortable, Heydrich toasted with cognac. For him, it wasn't atrocity. It was the elegant solution to a problem. It was efficiency. When he was sent to Prague in September 1941 as Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia, he arrived to crush the local resistance. And he did it in his own way, with a policy he himself dubbed stick and carrot. The stick was summary executions, mass arrests, and torture. The carrot was extra rations for workers who increased production in the armaments factories. In a few months, he imposed a brutal order. Strikes stopped, production soared, and hundreds were executed. Hitler was impressed. The Czechs, in alleys and taverns, whispered a new name for him: the Butcher of Prague. He ruled the city with one hand holding a conductor's baton and the other wielding the whip of an executioner. But in London, in the Czechoslovak government in exile, President Edvard Beneš watched in despair. His country, the first victim of Hitler's ambition, was being silenced, forgotten by the world. Beneš needed a dramatic act, a gesture that would shout to the world that his people had not surrendered, that Czechoslovakia still resisted. That's when the name emerged: Reinhard Heydrich. Killing him was not just a matter of opportunity, it was a matter of symbolism. Heydrich represented the purest, most lethal, and invincible essence of Nazism: intelligence, method, and inhumanity. Killing him would be more than eliminating a man, it would be thrusting a spear into the heart of the Reich's invincibility myth. Thus was born Operation Anthropoid. 2 young soldiers, the Slovak Jozef Gabčík and the Czech Jan Kubiš, were chosen. Both volunteers, both knowing the mission was almost certainly a one-way ticket. In the frozen fields of Scotland, they trained exhaustively. They learned to kill silently, to parachute into darkness, to assemble and disassemble British weapons. Each received a cyanide capsule, the last resort to ensure that, if captured, silence would be their final legacy. On December 28, 1941, they jumped from a Halifax bomber over the frozen landscape of occupied Bohemia. They carried few weapons, fake maps, a radio, and an order that sounded more like a death sentence: eliminate the Butcher of Prague. The plan was drawn up, the order given. But how could just 2 men, lost in enemy territory, even approach the architect of Nazi terror, a man who controlled the entire security apparatus of the continent? The answer to that question would define not only their fates, but that of an entire nation. The winter of 1942 was brutal. Gabčík and Kubiš, along with other paratroopers sent from London, struggled to survive. Their landing left them miles from the planned drop zone and out of contact with the local resistance. The biting cold and thick snow were their only companions. Every door they knocked on was a mortal risk, not just for them, but for those who helped. The Gestapo was everywhere, and the decree was clear: anyone harboring an enemy agent would be executed along with their entire family. Even so, there were those who risked everything: priests, doctors, workers, housewives. A web of silent courage began to form around the agents, a network of ordinary people who refused to accept that evil was invincible. Moving from hideout to hideout, they finally reached Prague. The city, under Heydrich's rule, was a trap. SS patrols and Gestapo informants infested the streets. Gabčík and Kubiš were ghosts, moving through the shadows, listening to the city bells that marked the hours they had left. They needed a plan as precise and methodical as the man they intended to kill. For weeks, they observed Heydrich's routine, and they discovered a flaw in his armor: arrogance. Despite warnings from his subordinates and direct orders from Berlin, Heydrich refused to use an armored car or have an armed escort on his daily commute from his villa to Prague Castle. He traveled in a dark green Mercedes-Benz convertible, open-topped, as if on parade. "My Czech people understand me," he said with disdain. He believed the fear he inspired was his best protection. This blind confidence, an error he would never forgive in a subordinate, would be his undoing. The agents found the perfect spot: a sharp bend in the Holocaust district, where his driver was forced to slow dramatically. There, the power of the Reich would be compelled to nearly stop. It would be the point of the strike. The plan was suicidal in its simplicity. Gabčík, armed with a Sten submachine gun, would step in front of the car and open fire. Kubiš, positioned behind, would throw a modified anti-tank grenade as Plan B. There was no elaborate escape plan, just the hope of blending into the crowd and disappearing into the city's labyrinth. On the other side of Europe, in London, President Beneš was haunted by doubts. What if they fail? Asked the skeptics in the British government. What if the retaliation is worse than the act? Beneš stood firm. "Even if they die," he replied, "the world will know we resisted." Those words became the agents' mantra. They were not there to live, they were there to be remembered. The morning of May 27, 1942 dawned clear and cold. At 10:29 a.m., the artificial tranquility of the street was shattered by the sound of the approaching Mercedes engine. Heydrich was in the passenger seat, his uniform impeccable, his gaze lost on the horizon. The car slowed as it entered the bend. The moment had arrived. Gabčík leapt forward, raised the Sten, and pulled the trigger. Nothing, just a dry metallic click. The gun jammed. For a second that seemed an eternity, the world stopped. Heydrich, whose face first showed surprise, now twisted in fury. Instead of ordering the driver to accelerate, his wounded pride made him shout, "Stop the car! I'll get that bastard myself." The driver braked sharply. It was the second fatal mistake. The moment the car stopped, Kubiš, who was on the sidewalk, acted. He threw the grenade. It didn't land inside the car, but exploded against the right rear side. The detonation was deafening. A shower of metal and shrapnel tore through the air. The car door was ripped off, and Heydrich's body was hurled against the vehicle's frame. Blood, smoke, and the smell of burning metal filled the air. Stunned, Gabčík and Kubiš fled in opposite directions. Heydrich's driver tried to pursue them, but was hit by a shot from Gabčík's pistol. When the smoke cleared, the scene was unbelievable. The protector of Bohemia, the all-powerful Reinhard Heydrich, lay on the sidewalk, clutching his abdomen, his uniform torn, his eyes wide in shock and pain. For the first time, the Reich seemed vulnerable. Rushed to Bulova Hospital, Heydrich's wounds initially didn't seem fatal. He was lucid, conversing, and even mocked the incompetence of his attackers. But the grenade had done invisible and lethal damage. Metal fragments and, crucially, horsehair from the seat stuffing had penetrated his body, mainly into his spleen. These fragments carried bacteria that triggered a rampant infection. Hitler, furious, sent his best doctors from Berlin. They tried everything: blood transfusions, massive doses of sulfonamides, one of the first antibiotics. But it was too late. Septicemia spread like fire. The man with the iron heart now fought his own poisoned blood. After days of agony and delirium, on June 4, 1942, the heart of terror stopped beating. Reinhard Heydrich was dead. The brain of fear had been destroyed. For the Allies, it was a resounding victory. But they hardly knew that, in his lair in East Prussia, Adolf Hitler was about to turn Europe into hell to avenge the death of one man. What he would order next would shock the world and forever raise the question of the price of resistance. The news of Heydrich's death hit Hitler's bunker like an earthquake. The Führer, who saw in Heydrich the ideal successor to Himmler and the embodiment of the new Nazi order, exploded in a rage rarely seen. His mourning was not for a friend, but for the loss of an irreplaceable tool. Vengeance, he swore, would be so terrible that the world would never dare touch a Reich officer again. The order was given to Himmler: do what must be done. Find the assassins and wash Bohemia in blood. The machinery of reprisal, methodical and merciless, began to turn. Prague plunged into a nightmare. Martial law was declared. A curfew was imposed. Posters sprang up on every lamppost, offering a reward of 1 million Reichmarks for information leading to the assassins. The amount, an unimaginable fortune, was a diabolical temptation, designed to turn neighbors into spies and friends into traitors. The Gestapo and SS, under the command of the new governor, Karl Hermann Frank, launched a massive manhunt. Thousands were arrested on the slightest suspicion. Prisons overflowed, and firing squads worked day and night. The period of terror became known as the Second Heydrichiada. Meanwhile, Gabčík, Kubiš, and 5 other paratroopers found refuge in the crypt of St. Cyril and Methodius in the heart of Prague. Helped by Orthodox Church priests and resistance members, they lived in a damp, dark underground, a premature tomb. Above them, life in the city continued under the weight of fear. Inside the crypt, time seemed suspended. They heard the sounds of the city, the footsteps of patrols, knowing each hour could be their last. The Gestapo, like a wounded beast, sniffed through the city, tightening the noose. And then the focus of Nazi vengeance turned to a place that would enter history as an eternal symbol of barbarity: Lidice, a small, peaceful mining village a few kilometers from Prague. Lidice had no proven connection to the assassination attempt. Its condemnation came from a suspicious intercepted love letter that vaguely mentioned the village. It was pretext enough. In the early hours of June 10, 1942, SS trucks surrounded Lidice. The operation was carried out with the coldness of an industrial procedure. All 173 men and boys over 16 were locked in a barn. They were then taken in groups of 10 to a wall where they were shot. The 203 women were separated from their children and sent to the Ravensbrück concentration camp. The children's fate was the cruelest. Of the 105 children of Lidice, a few, deemed racially pure, were sent for Germanization. The other 82 were taken to the Chelmno extermination camp in Poland and murdered in gas vans. After the population was eliminated, SS troops set fire to every house. Tractors were used to demolish the ruins. The cemetery was desecrated, and even the local stream was diverted. The soil was plowed. The name Lidice was erased from maps. A Nazi officer proudly declared, "Lidice no longer exists." The act was filmed and photographed for propaganda and as a warning. As the ashes of Lidice cooled, in Prague, the noose around the assassins tightened. The Gestapo finally found its break. Karel Čerda, one of the support group paratroopers who had deserted and hidden with his mother, could not withstand the psychological pressure and the temptation of the reward. On June 16, he voluntarily went to Gestapo headquarters and told everything he knew. In exchange for 1 million marks and a new identity, he betrayed his comrades. Čerda's betrayal was the most painful blow to the Czech resistance, a wound that never healed. His name would forever become synonymous with cowardice. With Čerda's information, the Gestapo now knew where to look. The fate of the 7 men hidden in the church was sealed. In the early hours of June 18, the Reich's vengeance would find its final target. Over 800 SS and Gestapo soldiers surrounded the church of Saints Kirill and Methodius. Machine guns were positioned in the windows of neighboring buildings. The ultimatum for surrender was ignored. The sound of the silence that preceded the battle was the harbinger of death. How long could 7 men resist an army? And how would they choose to meet their end? The answer would come with the first ray of sunlight. The dawn of June 18, 1942, broke with the sound of machine guns. The assault on the church began. The Nazis expected a quick surrender, but they encountered fierce resistance. 3 of the paratroopers, including Jan Kubiš, were on guard in the church choir, upstairs. From their positions, they managed to repel the first SS attacks who tried to storm through the main door. The firefight was intense. Hand grenades were thrown through the church windows, filling the sacred space with smoke, dust, and the smell of gunpowder. For 2 hours, the 3 men fought bravely, but the odds were impossible. Kubiš, gravely wounded by grenade shrapnel, bled to death. The other 2, out of ammunition, used their last bullets on themselves. The battle for the upper floor was over, but the resistance was not. The remaining 4 men, including Jozef Gabčík, were entrenched in the underground crypt. The only entrance was a small opening under a stone slab on the church floor. The SS, frustrated, tried everything to flush them out. They threw tear gas grenades, which were promptly thrown back by the defenders. Then, in an act of desperation, Prague's firefighters were called and ordered to flood the crypt with high-pressure hoses inserted through a small street-facing ventilation window. From within the flooded darkness, the paratroopers used a ladder to push the hoses out, continuing to shoot at the soldiers. The battle lasted hours. Surrender was offered to the besieged. The response came in the form of more gunfire. Finally, Karel Čerda, the traitor, was brought to the site to shout to his former comrades, urging them to give up. "We are Czechs! We never surrender!" was the reply that echoed from the crypt. Knowing the end was imminent, with the water rising and ammunition running out, the 4 men made their final decision. Just like their comrades upstairs, they honored the pact made months earlier in the Scottish training fields. When the SS troops finally blew open the crypt entrance and stormed in, they found only silence and death. Each of the 4 men had taken his own life. None was captured alive. The Reich's vengeance was complete. Heydrich's assassins were dead. The Gestapo, in a final act of cruelty, decapitated the agents' bodies and displayed their heads as a macabre warning. The retaliation extended to the Orthodox Church. Bishop Gorazd, the priests, and the lay leaders who helped the paratroopers were arrested, tortured, and executed. The church was closed and sealed. But the effect of the Lidice massacre was the opposite of what Hitler expected. The news, proudly disseminated by Nazi propaganda, spread like wildfire around the world. Instead of inspiring terror, it inspired fury and solidarity. In London, Washington, and Moscow, newspapers splashed the name Lidice in blood-red headlines. What was meant to be an example of power became a symbol of Nazi depravity. The name that was supposed to be forgotten became a banner of resistance. Cities in the United States, Brazil, Mexico, and other countries named streets and squares in its honor. In Britain, miners launched a campaign called Lidice Shall Live, raising funds to rebuild the village after the war. Genocide ceased to be a rumor and gained the face of murdered children.
As the world united around the name of Lidice, the question posed in London became more painful and complex. Was it worth it? Thousands of innocent civilians dead, an entire village erased from the map. Was this the price of killing a monster? The answer was not simple. While the reprisal was brutal, Heydrich's death left a vacuum at the heart of the Reich. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect, noted in his diaries that with Heydrich's loss, the regime lost one of its few truly efficient brains. The Nazi machine, though still lethal, became more chaotic, more reactive, and less strategic. Paradoxically, Heydrich's death accelerated the project he himself had masterminded. In his tribute, the Nazis launched Operation Reinhard, which led to the construction of the extermination camps at Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec. The death industry, now without its chief engineer, operated in a mode of uncontrolled fury, consuming resources and manpower desperately needed on the battlefield. The logic of terror, without its master, began to devour itself. When the war finally ended, amid the smoldering ruins of the Third Reich, the true accounting of the horror came to light. In files captured by the Allies, spreadsheets and memos revealed the German precision applied to barbarity, and at the center of it all was the name Reinhard Heydrich. During the Nuremberg trials, his name was cited dozens of times. Prosecutors called him the engineer of the final solution, the mind behind the industrialization of genocide. There was a bitter and ironic realization. If Heydrich had survived, his cold intellect and organizational ability might have made the Nazi regime even more efficient in its cruelty and perhaps prolonged its existence. His death, though it triggered terrible vengeance, exposed the fundamental flaw of every totalitarian system, the belief that absolute control is possible. The fates of the characters in this story sealed their legacies. Karel Čerda, the traitor, was found after the war. Tried for treason, he was hanged in Prague in 1947. They say that before the execution, when asked how he could betray his comrades, he replied coldly, "I think you would have done the same for 1,000,000 marks." His name became a curse in the Czech Republic, a synonym for national shame. On the other hand, the streets of Prague gained new names, Gabčíkova and Kubišova, in honor of the heroes who refused to kneel. Their photos, young, determined faces marked by the gravity of their mission, adorn memorials. They did not live to see the freedom for which they fought, but their act redefined the meaning of courage. And the village of Lidice, from the scorched earth, a new symbol was born. A new Lidice was built near the original site, which was turned into a memorial. The sign saying, "Lidice lives around the world," became reality. The crime intended to prove Nazi power transformed into internal testament to its moral ruin. Memory, as it turned out, was stronger than fear. Over the decades, the central question remains, was it right to kill him? The moral debate continues. Some historians argue that Operation Anthropoid was a strategic mistake. Heydrich's death did not alter the course of the war, but provoked the deaths of over 5,000 innocent civilians. It was an unacceptable price. Others claim there was no choice. Leaving the architect of the Holocaust alive would allow the terror to become permanent and normalized. For the resistance, it was a necessary act of psychological warfare. Proof that even the Nazi Olympian gods were not immortal. The Czech survivors themselves often responded with cold logic. He would have killed millions anyway. We just stopped him. There is no easy answer because war offers no clean dilemmas, only tragic choices. At its core, this episode is not just about espionage and vengeance.
It's about morality in times of darkness. Heydrich believed humanity could be reduced to an equation, that fear was a controllable variable. Gabčík and Kubiš proved otherwise, that human dignity is a constant, a flame that can bloom even under the most intense terror. The British historian Lawrence Rees summed it up perfectly. The fatal mistake of every tyrant is to forget that a human being is not a variable, it is a flame. That flame survived. It burned in the ruins of Prague, in the ashes of Lidice, and in the memories of those who refused to forget. Remembering the story of Heydrich is not glorifying evil, but recognizing the price of omission and the power of resistance. Operation Anthropoid showed that morality, when tested, is not measured by immediate results, but by the intent to oppose injustice, even when the cost seems unbearable. Because in the end, what really killed Heydrich was not a grenade. It was the courage of two men who refused to believe that evil was inevitable.
The story of Lidice and Operation Anthropoid shows us that, even in the darkest hours, courage leaves a mark that no empire can erase. If you believe these stories need to be told so that the past never repeats, subscribe to the channel and be part of this mission to keep the flame of memory alive. Because the past is not a distant echo. It still lives in us. And remembering is not reliving the pain. It's preventing it from happening again.